I'm really excited for tonight's event, which is called Migrant Father Fragment, which is about these sort of semi-autobiographical, autobiographical tales that sort of converge fiction and essay, poetry, and the novel, often bringing in forms of fragment, erasure, gaps. We have Kim Zhang with her new book from Kaya, Accomplice to Memory, and Thị Diễm Thúy, author of the classic, I think classic, The Gangster We're All Looking For. So the person who will do all the heavy intellectual lifting is Hua Hsu, who is a member of our board, as well as a contributor to The New Yorker. He's a professor of English at Vassar and the author of the book The Floating Chinaman from Harvard University Press. It's a great book about H.T. Zhang and what China meant in the American imagination in the 20th century. You can read more about that book online, and we have it for sale along with, I think, the other two books at the back. So the final thing I'll say is the bathrooms are right there. So let's give Hua a hand, and he'll introduce the other writers.
Actually, all three books aren't available for sale due to a, I don't know whose fault it is, but due to an error that was not the workshop's error. There are no copies of Accomplice to Memory. It's a beautiful book. I encourage you all to buy it. So if you go on your phone and order it while I'm talking, I won't be offended. The workshop will eventually have books, but they've just been rerouted to somewhere mysterious. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. I'm not particularly, I'll just mainly be lurking on stage tonight and hopefully asking some questions. I'm bad at the sort of convention of introducing people based on their CVs, so I just want to kind of enthuse and talk a bit about why, when we were conceptualizing this event, we thought the combination of these two authors would work out really splendidly. And I think one thing, if those of you who are new to the workshop, if you keep coming to our events, I think it's one of our signatures that we end up kind of putting together authors or putting together texts in an unusual or interesting way. And I often say to Ken that I think we're way ahead of our time in that regard, and hopefully someone will recognize this someday. Anyhow, so when I first learned about these two books actually fairly recently, and it's really going to be a treat to sort of have Kim and Thuy in conversation. And it's really raised a lot of issues for myself in my own writing. As I often will write about my parents or my grandparents in my writing for The New Yorker, and whenever I sort of, as the dutiful son, show these pieces to my parents, their reaction is often, that's not actually how it happened, or you're misremembering, or Texas wasn't as racist as you remember it. And I often find this really curious because these are often memories. Maybe they're things that I've misremembered. Maybe they're things that I've sort of embellished, or they've sort of taken on these coats of meaning for me. And to be told by my parents that that's not how things happen is profoundly disturbing. And it's something I think about a lot because in my capacity as an English professor, I'll often teach classes on literary nonfiction and nonfiction writing. And even when these classes are pegged to ideas of criticism or cultural journalism, the classes will invariably move toward memoir, right? Toward first-person writing. We live in this golden age of sort of first-person narrative, and we all have stories to share. And there's never really been a time when any of us could sort of offer our story onto the internet or to the world via the internet, and find audiences, right? Find people with whom your experiences resonate. And whenever I'm teaching this class, we always have these conversations about different techniques for writing about oneself, writing about one's family, writing about one's own experiences. And it usually comes down to this question of sort of whether you kind of bleed on the page, whether you aspire for a kind of transparency, a kind of one-to-one transference of sort of my personal details to your brain, this sort of deeply confessional, kind of raw confessional mode. And I'm always the one who really prefers opacity. And sometimes I wonder if that has to do with my sort of positionality as an Asian American writer, but I'm always really drawn to things that are fragmented, things that are sort of heavily footnoted, or things that really leave a lot of absences and gaps. And by the end of the semester, my students can sort of mimic exactly what I want. And it always it's very interesting to see how they interpret this call to sort of take apart their memories and put them back together in this way that kind of keeps a little bit for themselves. So I like writing that captures the difficulty of holding on to the past, as well as the potential trauma of revisiting it, of trying to find the perfect words, the perfect language, the perfect images to sort of return into that past. And one thing that I really love about both of the books that we'll be discussing tonight is sort of the use of fragments, the use of anecdote, the use of scenes and imageries that don't initially seem like these sort of grand set pieces for American literature, and yet they are. And both of these books are about sort of the process of writing, the process of storytelling, memories butting up against each other. And I think these are particular images, I mean, these are issues that are particularly fraught for immigrant writers or sort of writers who are dealing with dislocation, displacement, where so much is lost to language, to translation, and where the narrative of sacrifice gets written onto moments that were experienced as moments of pure day-to-day survival. Both of these books are really wonderful meditations on the sort of in-between spaces that comprise memory, that comprise the past. I actually just taught Thuy's book in one of my classes, and there's actually a midterm question on it that was very difficult. But there's this really lovely scene in which the daughter and the father in The Gangster We Were All Looking For, Thuy writes that they were passing the silence back and forth like a smoke. And it's a very tense and intimate and quiet scene. There's so much silence in this scene, and yet there's an enormous tenderness that I recognize in the father asking the daughter if she is hungry. And it's in these moments that I think, I don't know, hopefully this is sort of a conversation we'll have today about sort of these choices we make as authors, sort of where to locate sentiment in ways that most readers might not recognize. Similarly, Kim's book, which does it come out, is it already out?
March 28th.
Okay, good. Which will be out soon, but again, if you want to go on your phone right now and order it, that's perfectly fine with me. It really does this incredible job. It calls to mind Sebald, it calls to mind so many amazing attempts to sort of go into the archive of the past and sort of the troubles we have in trying to verify things, the troubles we have feeling accountable to these figures of the past. And there's this lovely line in it. Near the end, this spoils nothing to say that in the book, the daughter who is reconstructing her father's story, there's a moment where the father looks and says, he is looking to me to write him free. And whether or not that happens is, you'll have to read the book to find out. But I'm really excited to introduce Kim first. She teaches at Hampshire College, where she teaches classes on sort of writing and sort of the spaces between sort of Chinese and American identity. This book, I guess we'll talk a bit about the process, but it's a really wonderful meditation on memory recovery, but most of all accountability, and sort of the accountability we have when we are sort of entrusted with another's story. So let's introduce Kim.
To put these lights down a little bit here. Yeah, great. That's good. Is there any Hampshire in the room tonight? Just Thuy and I. Thuy and I share a Hampshire connection. So the stories I'm going to read to you tonight are about a daughter's desire to know her father and the impossibility of knowing him. After a lifetime of traveling back and forth to China with my father, interviewing him, recording his words, doing what I thought was family history, he opened a secret that undermined everything I thought I knew about him, and forever blurred for me any clean distinction between memory, history, and imagination. Accomplice to Memory is a hybrid text out of necessity. So for this reading tonight, I have tried to select excerpts that will give you a sense of the different hybrid forms that make up this book. And it's difficult to read a hybrid text because of the way the different parts work against each other. So I've tried to select pieces that'll give you some sense of that. A father-daughter story unfolding in the present. The story of a fictional character named Wang Kun, who is making his way out of wartime China in the 1930s and 40s. And the documentary images that work at a slant to both stories. The way my father tells it, the way I try to write it, he was just an unwitting bystander, a passerby on his way to something better. Never saw a Japanese, never knew a communist, never witnessed the civil and world wars that just happened to coincide with the first 3 decades of his life in China. He only had eyes for the Americans. Never sent to the front, never touched an exploding pencil, never was privy to the meaning of the radio messages he received or the violent ends to which they were put. And except for that one day when he just happened to be in the city, he never saw the bloated bodies that piled up on the streets of Chongqing over 3 years of bombing. I come to the hospital lugging books, photos, maps, videos, hoping to resurrect whatever traces of the past are left in my father. I drop names, the head of a department, a city gate, trying to determine whether the carefully wrought meanings I have arrived at line up with his experience, trying to separate historical fact from hospital hallucination, a good story from a true one. My father has been telling stories his whole life in America, the one about the Chinese Boy Scout, the one about the quartered passport. Just a few months prior to his fall down the stairs, bursting 3 blood vessels in his left temporal lobe and landing him in this hospital, he told another one, a story I'd never heard before, a story he'd never told anyone this side of the Pacific, a story that unraveled all his previous stories. Now my father is unraveling before my eyes. Past and present bleed into each other. What seems clear to him one day turns cloudy the next. Each time I show him the photo of the bodies on the steps, he looks as if seeing it for the first time. Mostly he just shakes his head when presented with these historical artifacts. Still, he looks forward to my visits, what I will bring him, where I will take him. He is curious about what I am writing and asks me to read my stories to him. He is mesmerized by my voice, speaking his life backwards to him. He recognizes himself in my stories, but is confused by his proximity to history. All this time, he tells me, he never thought to ask what he was being recruited for. Some of this is not in my favor, he says. Daming Temple sat on a bluff overlooking the river. Villagers came daily to the temple to burn incense, lay fruit, supplicate themselves before the statues of various deities, the fierce and the compassionate as needed. The fruit piled up brown and desiccated among the ashes on the altar tables. Ash was everywhere. It kicked up under the feet of the recruits and stuck in their throats, causing them to cough as they stepped over the gate and filed silently into the great hall. Dark green lanterns had been hung to light their way, casting a demonic glow over the relief-carved faces of the 18 bodhisattvas that lined the hall, benevolent witnesses to this midnight ceremony. At the front altar, a portrait of the Generalissimo was mounted in the place where the Sakyamuni Buddha should have sat. Or maybe the Buddha was still there and the Generalissimo was sitting on its lap, In this light, Wang Kun's eyes played tricks on him. Standing in front of the altar were three men. Luo Min was nearly unrecognizable, wearing a mask of a face that Wang Kun had never seen before. The training camp director was there too, looking oily and arrogant as always, and a man whom Wang Kun didn't recognize but would not forget after that night. This man was the shortest of the three, solidly built with a neck like a horse. He had a wide nose with flaring nostrils, steely eyes set unnaturally far apart, and a grim, determined mouth. When he opened it and began to speak, his mouth was full of gold. His voice was coarse and sugary, his words all praise and welcome for them. You are the first class of recruits for the Bureau of Investigation and Statistics. This work is not for ordinary people. Each of you has been selected for your high cultural levels and your special talents. You will serve the Generalissimo and your country. A cock appeared on the table, a beautiful brindle with flicks of orange in its feathers and a crown and wattle of brilliant red. It strutted across the table, jabbing its head this way and that, as if trying to figure out who was responsible for its predicament. The man with the mouth of gold reached for the cock and stroked it, all the while making soothing little clucking sounds. The cock arched its back with obvious pleasure and allowed the man to wrap surprisingly delicate fingers around its lovely neck. Still clucking softly, the man raised a sword that had magically appeared in his left hand and severed the cock's head from its body in one smooth stroke. The cock's head fell onto the altar table, a look of astonishment frozen on its face. Blood spurted from the cock's neck, still held tenderly in those feminine hands, and Luo Min was there to catch it in a hollowed-out gourd. Luo Min signaled for the inductees to form a line in front of the altar. One by one, they stepped forward to take the gourd and drink the freshly spilled blood, which had been sweetened with plum wine. "Don't breathe when you drink," she whispered as she returned from the table, lips glistening, cheeks flushed. When it was Wang Kun's turn, he held his breath and managed not to gag as the warm, viscous substance passed down his throat. He returned the gourd to its master, seeing the look of approval in the man's wide-set eyes. But it was the man's neck that fascinated him, so thick and sinewy, he couldn't help but wonder how hard it would be to pass a blade through that neck. A wave of nausea suddenly overcame him. Still holding his breath, he quickly returned to the anonymity of the line. As the newly inducted members of the Bureau of Investigation and Statistics pledged their allegiance, Wang Kun tried to breathe deeply and forget the sweet and salty taste of the blood. He was confused by the feelings that this man and this ceremony had stirred in him: pride, revulsion, and something else. He felt as if a chain had been slipped over his head, a chain made entirely of silk knots, so soft and so light that it would be easy to forget it was there. He must take care not to move too fast or too far in any one direction. He loosened his collar, fighting the urge to run. Trying to get his bearings, he looked at her. She was glowing in the green light, with a radiance that Wang Kun wished had been reserved for him. He looked at Luo Min. The mask had fallen slightly, and Wang Kun was relieved to see his friend, looking back at him with expectant eyes. Lunar New Year's Eve. I wheel my father through the hospital hallways, empty now except for the night shift nurses and those few family members who do not dare leave. A small paper lantern hangs from the IV pole attached to his wheelchair. My brother walks in front of us, rolling a pellet drum between the palms of his hands, the steady beating of the wooden pellets on the membranes of the two-faced drum bouncing off the walls like popcorn. My mother follows, smiling and nodding and offering candy to those who turn to watch this impromptu parade. My father has a dazed look on his face, the corners of his mouth twisted upwards in a grin or a grimace, I can't tell which, as if he knows he's supposed to be happy, but can't remember why. Earlier that evening, he'd poked suspiciously at the pork dumplings I'd made, seeming to recognize their shape, but refusing to put them in his mouth. "You made these?" he asked. "Yes, Dad, for the Chinese New Year." He nodded knowingly, but a minute later was asking again, "You made these?" The book on head injuries that I was reading advised that when a person starts going in circles, it's best to redirect or ignore them. But it was impossible to do either with my father. No matter the nonsense he spoke, it was impossible to treat him as if his brain was injured. When he posed questions like this, I was a child all over again, being asked to explain myself. "You made these?" Where was the emphasis of his question? Was he doubting my ability to cook Chinese food? Commenting on my foreignness as he always did with my mother? Or was he expressing his surprise over the fact that they were homemade dumplings rather than the store-bought variety that usually filled our freezer? Or was he worried that someone else had made them and perhaps had used bad ingredients or even poisoned them? "Yes, Dad, I made them myself with my own 2 hands in my own kitchen and brought them directly to the hospital for you." But he still refused to eat them. The association of the dumplings with the Lunar New Year, with lanterns and noisemakers to scare away evil spirits, with all the elaborate stories he used to spin for his American audiences, and the equally elaborate parties and performances our family had given over the years, all these associations were broken for him now, I realized. The dumplings were free-floating in a soupy concoction in which past, present, and future were indistinguishable. They were potentially dangerous dumplings, as likely to be made of human flesh as of pork. "You made these?" In the winter of 1938, a lone American arrived in Chongqing. He was a famous cryptologist, Lo Min told Wang Kun. During the First World War, he'd broken the Japanese diplomatic code and then pissed off the Americans by publishing the ciphers. He'd been invited to China by none other than General Dai himself. Here in Chongqing, at the Bureau, he would teach a new training class called the Chinese Black Chamber. It was Lo Min's idea to assign Wang Kun to be the American's driver, even though he knew that this position was beneath his friend and carried great risk. Wang Kun would be required to report on this man's every move, where he went, who he talked to, what he said. Still, it was a singular opportunity to get close to an American, and it would keep Wang Kun from being sent to the front. 3 days a week, Wang Kun drove this large, effusive man from his chateau overlooking the Jialing River in the diplomatic section of the city to the bureau headquarters just outside Tongyuan Gate. "Call me Harry," the American said, winking at Wang Kun. On these drives, Harry would rant about truth serums and incendiary pencils, about how the American government didn't appreciate his special talents, about how much he missed his girlfriend, and by the way, could Wang Kun help him to get some pussy? He winked and sweated and swigged from a slim glass bottle he carried in his briefcase. "I'm a maverick," Harry said to Wang Kun. "Do you know what that is, boy?" At first, Wang Kun thought Harry was confiding in him, but soon realized he talked this way to everyone, treating everyone as his personal confidant, posing questions that he would then answer himself. Wang Kun had never met anyone like Harry. He seemed to know no boundaries between private and public. He said whatever he liked, whenever he liked, without apparent consequence. In Chongqing, he was courted by everyone, everywhere he went, most notably by the man with the gold in his mouth, whom Harry jokingly called the Hatchet Man, never to his face, of course, and always in English, winking at Wang Kun. "How does he do it?" Wang Kun marveled. As a child, I watched my father play the laughing Chinaman to American audiences. He knew all the jokes about Chinamen, their inscrutable nature and their pidgin English, and always beat his fellow Americans to the punchline. Why don't the Chinese have phones? Because there are so many Wings and Wongs, they're afraid they'll wing the Wong number. Always positioning himself as the butt of the joke. Upon request, he would recite Confucian proverbs to red-faced white men downing their drinks at cocktail parties. When all the men in town grew beards in honor of the bicentennial, and all my father could manage were 3 long wispy tails sprouting from his chin, he just laughed and pressed his palms together in a low bow. And when the town held its annual ethnic fest, he would don a silk smoking jacket, set up a booth, and wield his calligraphy brush with great flourish, smiling broadly as he offered sage advice in bold black strokes on strips of auspicious red paper. Your father's a real character, people would tell me. He was well known and well liked, one of only a handful of Chinese living in the town, the others being either university professors or restaurant owners who spoke little English. He was often asked to appear at public events such as the opening ceremony of the baseball season, his foreignness heightening the pleasure and excitement of the occasion. The local press regularly ran stories and photographs of him. In one photo, he stands grinning on second base, wearing a silk cap with a long black braid and holding a sign on which one large Chinese character had been written, Tao, meaning to steal. I hated these photographs with their ridiculous captions. This laughing Buddha in a smoking jacket was not the man I knew as my father, a man who had impossibly high expectations of himself and his children, who worried constantly about money and the future, who woke up shouting in the night. A man who trusted no one but desperately wanted the respect of others, a charming man with a frightening temper. I could not hold these dissonant images of my father together. I could not reconcile the Chinaman who had captivated the town with the proud, angry man I thought I knew so well. I did not know what to do with my father's anger, how to hide it, where to keep it, much less to ask where it came from. I dream I am digging through stacks of books, searching for my father. I finally find him in a history textbook. The sepia-tinted photograph slightly out of focus. He is wearing his fedora and a long wool coat and stands dead center in the photo, surrounded by a restive crowd. Behind them is a train. Steam spews from the hot engine and their cold mouths. Finally, some tangible evidence. I find another volume with a fountain pen stuck between the pages about halfway through, as if someone had marked the place but never returned to it. The binding of the book is now permanently cracked open to that page. There is a passage underlined in blue ink. I can't read the words, but know that they implicate him, name him. He has been found out. There are other passages marked throughout the book. Someone has been stealthily tracking him, noting his every move, his presence at this time or that place with these people. I must hide the book. I must protect him. There is a slip of paper wrapped around the pen, and I carefully unroll it. It's thin, like tissue paper, the same blue ink. The tracker has left herself a note. Dates and names line up perfectly in 2 incriminating columns labeled World History and Wang Kun's Life. That's just circumstantial, I want to scream at the tracker. That doesn't prove anything, but the tracker is long gone. Thank you.
You left your notebook up. That was great. And just a reminder, hopefully that enticed you. If you're interested in getting the book, you could order it at the workshop or order it online. Next up, we have Thị Diễm Thúy. She's a performer, poet, and novelist, known for performance pieces such as The Red Fiery Summer, The Body is Between Us. Her work has appeared in the Massachusetts Review, Harper's. She's been bestowed with so many honors from the Radcliffe Institute as well as the Guggenheim. And she's also the author of this really fabulous 2003 book, The Gangster We Were All Looking For. Let's welcome Thúy.
I actually love how Hua doesn't really do big intros. So I thought, like, all you need to know about me is I was a girl raised by young men, like in their late 20s and 30s. If I had an avatar, it would be a wolf raised by librarians. So, let me see if I can bring this down. I want to thank Ken for shooting me that email the day after Moonlight won, asking if I would come. It seemed kind of impulsive, so I said, yeah, sure. And also want to thank the Asian American Writers Workshop. The first reading I ever did that I got paid for was with the Asian American Writers Workshop. I was a student at Hampshire, and they came to Amherst College and invited me to read with them. And I read a short story, which was an early version of Gangster, and was called I Put 3 Feet in Front of Me. And it never became anything but something that was precursor. And it was about a girl walking on a beach in Vietnam. So it was one of the early iterations of this book. I get songs in my head, and I got one this morning so bad, so I'm just going to let it out before I start reading. And so today I got this song in my head. Come on, baby, let the good times roll. All right. Okay, so I'm going to read from The Bones of Birds, which is the 4th chapter in Gangster. And I'll just jump around and read, and then we'll talk after. What happened during those hours when I sat in the fishing boat and waited for my father to return? Were they hours or only 1 hour or 1/2 of 1 hour? It was after sundown. We were escaping, so we needed darkness. But I don't remember darkness, and I don't remember light. I was waiting in the boat, and the boat filled with people. But I remember no one other than my father. He walked slowly toward me, gently pushing everyone else aside. He picked me up and kissed my hair. He stroked my face and rocked me, even though I wasn't crying. The boat must have cut into the water as it pulled away from the shore, but I don't remember the sound of the water, and I don't remember the shape of the shore. Is this because of the darkness? Or is it because we didn't turn around once to look at the lights of our town? My father stared ahead at the stars and at the moon, which was half full and half vanished. After Ma arrived, our family moved from one apartment building to another before finally settling in Linda Vista. It was there that my father made his closest friend, a Vietnamese man down the street with whom he would sit on the front steps in the evenings and talk about the past. They agreed that the past was when they were young and in Vietnam. So young they still believed that if a beautiful girl riding by on a bicycle offered so much as a sidelong glance, it was reason enough to chase after her. Sipping bottles of beer, they talked about the war and how it was their youth, and how when it ended, it was like waking from a long dream or a long nightmare. And now the war was in the past. Chewing on salted peanuts, they talked about how certain foods were in the past and certain smells. For example, the smoky smell of dried cuttlefish as it was being roasted over a charcoal stove, and the smell of the first rain after the dry season. They watched as cars drove by, and my father remembered the rivers crowded with fishing boats, and the children who sat cross-legged on the floor of those boats, mending their families' nets. As evening approached, they talked about heat as something that was in the past, as well as certain fruits, the dragon fruit, for instance. The sky turned indigo above them, and as they stood up to wish each other good night, my father and his friend agreed that certain colors also seemed to have vanished, like red. Red was in the past. Late at night, unable to sleep after having moved from his bed to the couch to 4 dining room chairs lined up in a row, he drives down to the beach and spins the car wheels in the wet sand, daring himself to drive into the sea. At daybreak, he drives the car home, parks it at the edge of the driveway, lowers the seat, and falls asleep, exhausted. He starts digging a trench around the base of a palm tree in the garden of one of the people he works for. He digs until his hands bleed. When he remembers that no one has asked him to do this, he packs up his equipment, pulls the lawnmower into the truck bed, and drives away. Let them call. Let them curse into the answering machine. He will never go back to that house again. Too drunk to drive from a friend's house and too proud to be driven, he decides to walk the 6 blocks home. He walks with one foot on the sidewalk and the other foot on the road. It makes him feel like a crippled soldier marching far behind the troops. Every 3rd step, he shouts out his own name. And the order, stand up straight. Stand up straight now. He becomes prone to rages. He smashes televisions, VCRs, chases friends and family down the street, brandishing hammers and knives in broad daylight. Then, from night until early morning, he sits on the couch in the living room, his body absolutely still, his hands folded on his lap, penitent. He sits in that position for hours, graced by the darkness, straining toward things no one can see. I grew up studying my father so closely as to suggest I was certain I saw my future in him. I would inherit his lithe figure and beautiful smile. I would build and break things with my hands. I would answer to names not my own and be ordered around like a child. I would disappear into every manner of darkness, only to awaken amid a halo of faces encircling my body. Shame would crush me. I would turn away from the people I loved. I would regard with suspicion the bare shoulders of a woman I desired. The sight of 2 boys shooting marbles in a dirt yard would fill me with sadness. I would drink to lies about the past. I would beg the dead to come for me. The sight of a young girl playing house, sweeping out an imaginary courtyard with a branch of eucalyptus, and the little song she sang about a fluttering butterfly, and the way her arm described the course of its body in flight would haunt me. Whereas my father would disappear into himself when haunted, I would leap out of windows and run. If there were no windows, I would kick down doors. The point was to get to the street at any cost. I would come to see running as inseparable from living. I would choose falling asleep on rooftops and on the lawns of strangers to lying in my own bed, surrounded by knots of memories I had no language with which to unravel. Yet, exactly like my father, I would become suspicious of tenderness and was calmest when I had one hand quietly lying over the other, both ready to be raised in an instant, shattering to the bone whatever dared come too near to me. One night, when my father was sitting on the couch looking sad and broken, he turned and realized there was someone standing where he had thought there was only a shadow. He came for me then because I had seen him. I leapt through a window and ran from the house, but before I could make it to the street, he caught me by my hair and pulled me back inside. Gripping my head with one hand, he raised the other and demanded to know what I had seen. To protect myself, I tried to forget everything. That first night at the refugee camp in Singapore, those early morning walks after we arrived in America, the sound of his voice asking a question no one could answer, the shapes his fists left along a wall, the bruises that blossomed on the people around him, the smell of the fruit he brought home from the gardens he tended, the way the air seemed charged with memories of blood, the nets we fell through faster and faster year after year, dreaming of land. The only thing I couldn't drive away was the memory of my brother, whose body lay just beyond reach, forming the shape of a distant shore. Ba would often come to me in dreams. We would pick out shirts together. "Feel this one," he says, brushing a soft sleeve against my cheek. In another dream, we sit across from each other at a corner table in a crowded cafe. By the way we're sitting, with legs slightly apart, hands flat on our knees, torsos bent forward, and by the way we're laughing, first with our eyes and then our heads thrown back, it is clear to everyone around us that we have become each other. I dream we live in one room. It is a small room. We share a bed. As I am lying down to sleep, he is getting ready to leave. He sits down on the edge of the bed, and I know from the weight of his body that he is leaving forever. I pretend to be asleep so he won't wake me to say goodbye, but because it is my dream, I see everything. He puts on one shoe and then the other, carefully tying the laces. He buttons his coat, a dark blue trench coat with epaulets that jut out. He takes his fedora off a nail on the wall, runs his fingers through his hair, and dons the hat. He picks up his keys from the bedside table and walks backward out of the room, his gaze moving from me to the windows, the table, the floor, and back to me again. He goes through the door without opening it. I remain in the room, both as the one feigning sleep and the one whose dream this is. As if from the sky of the dream, I glance at myself, then the windows, the table, the floor, and back again. I do this obsessively, pinning everything to its place. The nightmare of my return. I find him sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window. "Get up," I say. He doesn't answer. "Get up," I say again. I've come to fight him. He knows this and doesn't look at me. I am furious. I can hardly stand still. He continues looking out the window, and very slowly he slides his hands to the center of the table. They are covered in dirt and horribly swollen. They tremble as he lifts them from the table. It destroys me to see his hands like this. Ma enters from another room. "I didn't know how to find you, to tell you," she says, wringing her own hands. Years after I ran away, my father managed to find me. I had not dreamed the phone call. I was standing at the sink, filling a blue-striped bowl with soap and water when the phone rang. Cradling the receiver against my ear, I heard my father say my name twice, and then the word help in English, followed by the word ba in Vietnamese. I turned the water off and leaned against the kitchen counter in stunned silence. Instinctively, I looked toward the window but could not see out. The midday sun glared against the pane. I remember how dark the wood frame looked against the glass, like 4 pieces of wood trying to hold back a fire. I heard my father say that he was in trouble. He said the word trouble in English. In Vietnamese, he asked, "Do you understand?" "Yes," I said, and again, yes, and again, yes, 3 times in Vietnamese. What shook me? Was it the sound of his voice, reedy, high, and thin? or the fact that he was pleading and then crying? Or was it that I could say nothing in any language to make him stop? I fly over the streets and the stations that we passed through. I fly over the coastline of our town in Vietnam. I see the boat pulling away from the shore. The town doesn't vanish behind us, it merely recedes. I see us standing at the small fountain in that park in downtown San Diego. We are waiting among the sleeping homeless for the federal building to open so we can apply for our papers. My father wets his hands in the fountain and rubs the sleep out of my eyes. I fly along Orange Street, cut over to University, and circle the air above the Mexican bakery. I fly over the 4 blossoming lemon trees my father planted in the backyard of a house in La Jolla. I fly over Westinghouse Street and see the pink condominiums with their fenced-in swimming pools built after they kicked us out of our house and tore our block down. The smell of eucalyptus draws me toward a canyon. As I alight on the soft dirt of the canyon, I catch my father dancing. One night before Ma arrived, Ba took me to a party at the house of a friend of his down in Florida Canyon. Bored among the adults, I wandered outside. Slowly circling the house, I caught glimpses of the party as I passed each open window. I saw someone's necklace on the floor. I saw my father standing alone, his body swaying slightly from side to side. He had his hands down on either side of his hips and was moving them faster and faster like the connecting rods of a locomotive getting ready to take off. I saw a woman turn her head to look toward him. She smiled slowly. I saw him lift one foot and then the other, a soft stamping. I saw someone stand and walk toward the stereo. I heard the music go up. My father shook his head and almost laughed out loud, as though he just couldn't believe how fast he was moving now. Snaking beside rivers, tunneling through mountains, with each stamp of his foot, the train whistle exclaiming, "I'm here and gone, here and gone, here and gone." I looked away, distracted by the sound of something stirring in the canyon. When I turned back, I saw my father standing quite still, struggling to remain on his feet. His eyes were closed and his body, leadened by drink, twitched as if he felt suddenly surrounded. He gulped air, and after a while it became the rhythmic hiccuping of someone who has been sobbing for hours. I stood outside, looking in through the open window. He looked small. I thought of the bones of birds. I thought of a prized pebble in my palm. I closed my hand into a fist and pressed it hard against my body. Thank you.
Cool. That was amazing. And I'm really excited for this opportunity to have the two of you. Hopefully, I will just ask a couple of questions, and if you want to ignore them, if you want to use them as jumping off points, that's totally fine. My moderating style tends to be like, there's this old Saturday Night Live skit where the host just says like, "You're awesome" to the person. So rather than just doing that, you two are very awesome. I just have a couple of really brief questions, pretty obvious questions. And the first one is just about process, right? And I'm just curious, when, both of your texts are very lyrical. Thuy, you described your style as sort of oblique in the past. And the style itself sort of assumes an interest in process, in limitations of memory and the limitations of storytelling. And Kim, in your introduction, you said that it's a hybrid text out of necessity. So I'm just curious if you could just sort of riff on this idea of necessity, sort of the ways in which memories and stories necessitate these sort of unusual formal choices, or just sort of a choice to not just tell it as directly and chronologically and sort of in this unproblematized way that I think most people are used to with memoir, and most people tend to consume or read literature written by people of color that way too, right? It's just sort of like, oh, this is like an ethnographic foray into, you know, these people's lives. But both of your texts really, they're so intimate, and yet they sort of refuse that. So yeah, I guess this is like a process question.
I feel, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I feel like I need to muse on that a little bit because it was such a long process.
Yeah.
I mean, this book was a 10-year process, and the form that it finally took was not a form that I initially set out to write. I experimented with a lot of different ways of writing, and I mean, I think the reason it ended up taking the form that it does is because there was so much that couldn't be known. When a rug is pulled out from underneath sort of your stable understanding of the world, a history book, an archive, an interview transcript, all of these things that used to have a kind of stability no longer did. And so I felt that I had to play with those forms of knowledge and write them in ways that don't fit. For example, you talked about ethnography. I actually was trained as an ethnographer. I was trained as a social scientist, and I guess I believed in the power of those forms to understand people's lives. I certainly thought I understood my father's life. But when that rug is pulled out, the forms no longer worked, and I needed other forms. I needed other tools. So I experimented, and the fictive stories about Wong Kun began to take shape. In fact, there's a point in the book where my father and I we actually speak in the third person about him, about this fictive character, and it's easier for him to talk about himself through this fictive character. So we needed these forms even to talk to each other, because any question I would ask him would not produce some straightforward answer, obviously. So I had to experiment. But I didn't set out to write this kind of a text.
Were the images and photographs always part of
right?
how
So
you
then
wanted
there's
to do
the
that?
third, right? The third structure of the book are these images. There are about 130 of them that run through the text. Most of them are documentary photographs. A few are family archival images, but most of them are not. And when I discovered this trove of images, they began to shape my storytelling in a very intuitive way. So no, they weren't there at the beginning, but then I discovered the existence of many of these photographs that in Chongqing during the 1930s and 40s, and that began to inform my storytelling. I brought them to my father. I was originally trying to use them as a way to get him to tell stories, but it didn't work. So I began to use them to tell stories.
Is this on? Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I think form is really interesting to me. It's the thing for me. And until I find it, there's nothing. With Gangster, I was writing against the way in which Vietnamese people have been written out of the memory of the Vietnam War, basically. And that the way that an American the U.S. audience generally looks at the war is to focus solely on the U.S. soldier, right? And that Vietnam kind of, as a place with history and all of that, doesn't exist until the U.S. decides to go and bomb it, almost, right? And then it goes and bombs this place where these people die, and they're indistinguishable from the landscape. And so for somebody like me, I'm Vietnamese in the United States, like how am I supposed to approach those films? And how am I supposed to approach that memory? Because I know I came from there, but there's all this volume and violence around how it's depicted on the screen, where, you know, it's like this story focused on the US soldier, but Vietnamese people are not really subjects. And then a profound and very pregnant silence in the house, in the space of my home, where my mother would talk about, you know, the town that we came from, but without any context in terms of why we were here. Why did we leave, you know? And so it was there was a huge gap between the public presentation and then the private experience. And I have this thing where I feel like when people ask, like, what's your story? I'm like, who's asking and why, you know? And Gangster was really about, you know, I'm going to get this down in my time, in my way. And the point is to bring these people, like, who have a past, who have memories, who have desire for each other, who are rooted. I'm going to bring them to the page. And however we can figure out how to do that, that's the breadth of Gangster has to do with re-embodying particular people, the mother, the father, the daughter, and the dead brother. And I feel like that was my focus. There are these 4 Vietnamese people. 3 of them are in the US. 1 of them is dead in Vietnam. And they're bound to each other across this body of water, which is the Pacific. And it's how the refugees came to America. So it's like, in a way, I'm trying to draw together closer Vietnam and the US through this history. But the history has an aftermath. We are its aftermath. You inherited us. So, like, we became Americans, right? And I feel like you know, of course, I'm pissed off about this shit because, you know, people are like, refugees, where do they come from? Well, first, why are they moving? Like, why are they moving? And what about us refuses to be moved by the fact that they are forced to move? You know, that displacement is tied to our placement. So I just, you know, so I'm like, what is Gangster? To me, Gangster is like, these people from far away are here. And the way that we unpacked their arrival and their settling or unsettling settling is the story not just of themselves, but part of the inheritance of this country and its involvement in faraway places. Come on now. You know, so the form that we do that through in terms of the fragments is because something has been broken. I just feel like, you know, if you go and write a straight up narrative, like, let me tell you about myself, right? I feel like it's solely for appeasing the appetite of tell me your story. It's like, I am your story, actually. You know, like, I am a story of this place at this time. And so I'm telling you a story of you too, if you could only recognize yourself in me. And that was the challenge. I feel kind of like the focus on creating this father figure, this character, who I think is representative not just of my father's story, but really like, you know, what becomes of a man who has to say, I am a man, in a circumstance that is really about like not seeing him in any way, you know. So there's a lot of violence in the book, and I wanted to kind of find a way to bring that violence forward at a pace where it was embodied. Does that make sense? Because I feel like the stories come from inside our body's experience of life. And the pace of how we receive stories sometimes is just too fast and clean, you know. And sometimes I think the page is too clean for me personally even, you know. That's why it takes forever for me to write. Sorry.
So I think that idea of pushing back against the just like, tell me your story kind of thing, right? And, you know, in Accomplice Memory, you're not condemning your father for being like the laughing Chinaman, right? You're just sort of pointing out this is the role he occupied in this setting. You're not you're not condemning him, you're not sort of tearing into him. It's just sort of like the conditions of where we lived demanded that he play this role, right? And you're just sort of reflecting on it. This is a weird question, but do you fear that, I mean, for both of you, do you fear that like people won't get that there is that layer to what you're doing, right? Because it would be a lot easier to write the sort of neat on the page narrative, resisting the stereotype, resisting the ways in which a refugee gets folded into an imperial history. Like, do you fear that people won't get that? Although, I mean, that's sort of part of the challenge is to write something that people will sort of appreciate, but also feel alienated from, right? Or implicated.
I'm sure there are a lot of people who don't get Gangsters. I mean, you know, it's like a story about like a refugee family. It's sad. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's beautiful. But do people get a lot of the violence that is in it? Do people actually get that it's that the war, though largely unspoken, is the entire condition that drove these people to be here? So there's a lot of unpacking, which I feel like Gangsters benefited from people teaching it, because you can get into all the different layers. But there's another part where I think, yeah, like people can really just get into the beauty of this sad story, but somehow they made it because they're here. Yeah. You know what I mean? I'm just like, for real. You gotta be kidding me. You know? And it's like that, where it's like, I think that there's this tendency where, well, you got it down on paper, so triumph, right? Like, articulation is triumph. Whereas I think we gotta ask, like, what if articulation is like the continuation or the kind of highlighting of fractures? And to say, like, focus on the fractures. Like, we don't, by writing, or we don't mend them. Sometimes we are the first to point to them, you know? And I think there's a triumphalist quality to, like, well, if you can make a form, then it can hold. Like, it did hold all that. And in a way, I think it's part of the magic of writing or any art, where you do experience something. It's intense and vivid. But I am very resistant to the triumphalism of articulation. I really am, you know, especially as a writer, because I feel like there's this sense like that language somehow catches it. I'm not sure that it's a question for me, honestly. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe along the same vein, Accomplice to Memory, in a sense, ends in failure. I mean, in some way, there's a failure to know the father in this book, or to know our past, or to know our families. It's not a triumphal narrative. But the other thing going on, just sort of getting back to the stereotypes, is there are two different gazes, and maybe this is also true in your book, Thúy. You know, there's Americans looking at China, but there's also China looking at the United States. And my father was very much that, from that time period, really always looking, you know, to the U.S. But the Americans were all over China during the war, during that time period. And so I think part of the difficulty of writing a book like this is trying to get that double gaze, trying to be able to write, you know, both perspectives. And so, yeah, I think it could easily be misread or misunderstood. So, you know, people are going to read it according to where they're positioned. I don't know how it might be read in China. I'm interested to know how a Chinese, mainland Chinese readers would read this text. But I think there's that constant dilemma in the writing. And then, of course, the daughter is positioned in one place and the father is in another. And that's always... You know, the only way I could get into my father's head, really, was to create the character of Wang Kun. And so the memoir-like sections, the sort of first-person sections that are in the present tense, are really about, in a sense, are about the failure. The daughter's trying, right? She keeps trying. She's tracking him. She's doing research. She's interviewing him. She's doing all these things that she thinks these are the ways that we know each other. But ultimately, it's like 5 steps forward and then 3 backwards. There's a lot of undoing in the text, like she learns something and then she discovers, oh, well, that didn't really happen, or that was another woman, it wasn't this woman, those kind of things happen a lot. But the fictive stories are the place where the daughter actually can run with trying to imagine her father living through these times, which were very difficult. There was both civil and world war going on in China, and what it took to survive, both there, but also here. So it's a survival story, that has multiple dimensions to it. I'm not sure if every reader will get every aspect of that. And also, there's a lot of history I try to build into that text. And then I ended up writing these long footnotes at the end. I call them notes from the daughter's notebook. And there's a lot of them because it felt like without some of that historical context, I don't know if you grappled with that too. I mean, figuring out how do you build in enough history, but not too much, not heavy, in a heavy-handed way. So I ended up having, I forget how many pages of notes from the daughter's notebook that try to give the reader a little bit of context.
So one thing that I think both of you are sort of touching on is that difficulty, that the sort of fragmentary consciousness, the fragmentary attempt to the past. It's just sort of baked into one's like identity, or sort of how one understands the world. And I think both of your works do an incredible job of conveying that in a way that, like even if someone doesn't get it, they understand the difficulty of the project itself. And I always like the figure of like the asymptote in math, like the curve that approaches the line that never meets it. And I think of writing as this sort of like asymptotic process where it's like I'm trying to get to this thing and maybe I'll never get there, but that's sort of why we try. And it sounds sort of like identity, sort of retrieving the past. All of these things are sort of things that we attempt to meet, but perhaps we never will, right? So I guess given that both of your sensibilities are about that distance and about sort of moving towards it, maybe there's no way to answer this, but how do you know when a sentence works, or how do you know when a paragraph works, right? Because like earlier you said, without the form, there's nothing. I guess just as you're sitting there constructing these works, like how do you think about like whether a sentence or a description is too on the nose or sort of too distant? I don't know if this question makes sense.
That's a hard question.
Sorry.
Actually, I guess it's like there's this particular sentence in Gangster, and it's in The Bones of Birds, and it's a scene at the refugee camp where the father and the daughter are at the refugee camp in Singapore, and they're in the hammock, and she hears the sound, and she realizes it's the father crying. Mm-hmm. And the sentence that follows her realization is, "A dark cloud crossed the face of the moon. Time stopped. Time stopped. Then inexplicably, incredibly, it continued." And when I got, to a dark cloud, floated over the face of I remember when I was, and I could see it, and I knew that there would be that when they leave Vietnam, the moon is half full and half vanished. So the moon travels with them, kind of, right? And when I got to that sentence, and I got that it was the "k" sounds, a dark cloud crossed, right? It's that, and I knew. Thank Lord. I was like, yeah, that's how you want your cloud to cross the face of the moon. It's like that. And I can't really explain it. I really can't. But when you have those moments as a writer, right, you're like, hell yeah, that's it, Or like in Palm, the kid sitting in the box, the kissing box, there's a sequence where they're like hold their hands up to each other's face. And that's, as a writer, I'm sitting at my desk, putting my hand up to my face, like, and what does that feel like? I guess, so there's a way in which you lose yourself in that character and the character's reality in that sequence. And when the language, and so you're finding the language for the sensation of being alive in that way, I guess. And language, as we know, exists on multiple levels, right? I mean, you're creating a picture, but there's also the sound, and then there's the sense of what the language is doing. But then there's also the thing that it can't catch. And so it actually, when it works, you do feel the kind of shadow quality of language. And that's a very exciting, when it works, it's very, very exciting, yeah. But how do you know? Like, you know, you know, because you can feel it as if you didn't do it. And that's the reward. It's like, for me, I feel like it elsewhere came, or it's like it came through the scene, and yes, and that when time stopped, it stutters. It doesn't stop. It stops twice. It stutters, and then incredibly, inexplicably, it continues. And it's the, ly, ly again. It's like the way that you keep this stutter going with, yeah. But it's not conscious. When you break it down like this, it sounds like it's conscious, but it's not conscious. That's all I'm saying. Like, it's not. So much of, I think, the moments that work don't come to you because you will them. You're primed. It's like going up for the layup. You have to have the training. You know what I mean? If you're not, you wouldn't think that about me, right? But if you're not primed, then like you don't land it, And somehow I feel like, yeah, I don't.
I mean, part of the answer depends on the readers too. I don't feel like determining whether something is working is completely on my side of things, because it depends on how the reader experiences the text, and in that sense, I've succeeded if I've conveyed something that the reader connects with. But that said, there's a strange thing that happens to me when I write, that is a kind of a signal to me that I'm somehow close to the truth of an experience, which of course we're always trying to get to. We're trying to find the language that can represent that experience, or let's say represent your relationship with your father, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do with language. But what happens to me, I've never admitted this before, but what happens to me when I write and I get close, I feel like I'm close, my nose gets all stuffy.
Wow.
No, seriously, this is a very strange thing that happens when I write.
Huh.
When I feel like I'm getting really close to an experience, and
Jim, you do realize this is being recorded.
I realize that, and I'm admitting this. That's the writer's side of things, where I feel like, oh, I'm actually getting into something, as opposed to just playing with language. But the language is starting to connect to some experience. But I still feel like it's the other half of that is that the reader also has that experience of the language, and then I might say, oh yeah, okay, it did work. But I would have trouble saying on my own that it worked. I would want to hear the reader.
It's interesting because John Berger has a quote about, or he says this thing about how when a piece of writing works, it's got nothing to do with the style per se. It's the way in which experience is contained in there, on the words, on the page. Experience distinct from existence. That's how what he is breaking down, and and that you trust the writer, because so when he's saying, like, if something strikes you as authentic, it's nothing to do with style as such. It has to do with the way the words on the page convey experience distinct from existence.
Those are two incredible answers. I thought that was just like a weird, like, what's writing like question.
It was a hard question.
I know. I tend to ask questions that I would never want to answer. So, and my last question, and then we can open it up to a broader discussion, is One thing, Kim, that your father says is he was never aware of his proximity to history. And that really struck me because I think as people of color, oftentimes when you're not taught to understand that you have a proximity to history, like that's what an identity is, right? To have proximity to history and sort of be aware of that. And I think that sort of reminded me of, writing about my own parents and them not sort of understanding that they were part of like a wave of immigration or just a sort of post-Cold War moment. Right now we are obviously very proximate to history, right? And I think writers oftentimes we see ourselves as bearing witness to change, bearing witness to history, and now seems like an especially sensitive moment for that. This is just the election question. I'm just curious if sort of the nature of political discourse right now, or of just, it seems as though I've read so many things that are basically writers saying like, I want to be remembered for knowing this or understanding this in the years 2016, 2017. I'm just wondering if either of you have sort of grappled with that question as you've continued to kind of write and live in this moment.
That's right. I completely understand the question. You want to know what we want to be known for, or remembered for in this moment, or?
Well, you're both awesome, and you'll be known for that moving
that's
forward.
That's an impossible right. That's an impossible question.
But I guess I'm just wondering if I feel like after the election, there's so many hot takes about sort of what we should be doing as people who create culture and people who aspire to, think about expression. So I'm just wondering if that's sort of crossed your mind or if that's influenced anything.
Well, it has in terms of thinking about immigrant stories that need to be told.
Yeah.
And telling them in a way that recognizes the loss on both sides. The loss that drove the migration to begin with, but then the terrible loss on this side. I mean, having to play the role of the Chinaman, and my father inhabited it. That was his means of survival here. It pained me greatly to watch it. I mean, I write about it because it was extremely difficult to watch my father. I feel like we need immigrant stories that recognize those multiple kinds of loss and what it means to survive on both sides. And we just need more immigrant stories. We need to tell those stories. So, I mean, in that sense, that's how I think about this book coming into the world right now at this moment in time.
I hate election years. I hate them with a passion because the version, like the portrait of this country that gets presented is so stupid. It's so stupid. And I feel like part of what's so intense about this country is that we're, is like trying to recognize people who have always been part of the story. Come on now. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like in the Constitution that you count enslaved people as 3/5. Of course, those people were whole people, like before they were counted thus, right? Before they were acknowledged as citizens. So it's like, people arrive whole. They're historicized bodies leaning into the present. So the idea that somehow they, they need to find a time and place to enter just upsets me to no end. And every election year we present a portrait of this country that I feel is so backward, right? So I always, whether it's like kissing babies or having hot dogs or whatever it is, I'm just like, let it be over, Lord. And then it's over in the way that it is, and be careful what you wish for, girl, and I'm just like, ooh. And I feel like, but it makes me double down. No, really, it makes me double down on like, listen, the portrait hasn't been complicated enough, right? It hasn't been complicated enough. There have been people in the picture from way back that we have been like fighting just have acknowledged when we think about our history here in this country. You know, so with this recent executive order around, you know, the ban and Muslim ban, you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, like it's there from the late 1800s till 1943. And the idea of it is really about like, we want you, but only in a certain way. We want your labor, but not you to stay with your ladies or whoever. Like, it, you know, and there's this way where it's like, that's part of our history in this country, right? And it's like, I'm not Chinese American, but it's part of my history because, you know, every other kind of Asian introduces the next, right? So it's kind of like we can be like, no, that's not my history, but check it out. Before your father was the gardener, the Japanese were the gardeners. And, you know, so it's like it behooves us to know that there's a lineage across, right? So there's that. But also just feel like if we can be honest about our past, then we will create a more true portrait, you know. But I guess right now I feel like sometimes it's good to face up to the fuck upness of like who we are, like as a nation. And in some ways this is not new, but you know, as Baldwin says, right? It's like you got to face it. And I think that we're living in what I feel like there's a deep old history to this. I don't know, it feels prophetic. Like, I feel like we're living in a kind of prophetic time where it's like, are we going to face up to this stuff that has long roots? Or are we going to keep our head down and just hope for the best? I don't think that second part is really an option. Not when the storm's coming tomorrow.
So I think this would be a good opportunity to throw it to the crowd. If anyone has a question, comment. Yeah.
As sort of a follow-up to that, what's something that is giving you hope right now? I mean, like,
that's the hardest question.
From where that's coming from, it's like these days I wake up every morning and I think about how like 30% of America has never lived in proximity to like a brown person, and like there's no amount of like storytelling that we do on the coasts or like in major cities that's gonna reach these people. And like this to me is like the core of the problem as like an East Coast, West Coast, Ivy League, liberal elitist is like, you know, what can we do about that considering, you know, they elected Trump? Like, where do we go from here? What is this hope that drives us to continue?
I mean, this is way beyond the scope of my writing this book. I think we have to keep writing. I mean, I think we have to keep trying to write in ways that get closer to truth-telling. And I think we do need different forms for truth-telling. I think that the old forms, I mean, this is my experience of writing the book, that the old forms of truth-telling, the straight-up narrative, you know, the transcribed interview, the historical archive, that these, we have to put them into forms that speak, you know, across different experiences, different livelihoods. And that's something that I've really learned through writing this book. It's back to the discussion of form. You know, in some ways, there are more forms out there than ever before. I mean, you know, I'm not that savvy when it comes to social media, but I have students who are doing interactive work, you know, using media. I just think that we have to keep writing, but we also have to find different forms for telling truths about our lives. I'm afraid I don't have more than that. because your question is so big.
Yeah, I think it is a big question, but I also think that Trump does not have a mandate. And I don't think, we should be fooled about that at all. So there's that. I think, you have to keep being true and being real. But I think you have to, take root in substantive ways, however you can. And it can't be solely reactionary. It has to, there has to be actions and commitments that are about sustaining and enlarging the ground, enlarging the circle of concern, all of that. However you can, in whatever way you can, in whatever communities that, you're committed to. But more and more I would think that hope lies with one another, right? And that you can't be constantly, trying to get those Trump voters to see, feel, or X, Y, Z, in that reactionary way. Because it's kind of I think the problem in the country right now is that there are people whose vision encompasses lots of people, and there are people whose vision of the nation doesn't. And I think for those of us who are not included in that vision of the nation, we got nowhere to go. We're here. And so we have to take root and enlarge the ground that we're on to create those circles of concern. That's what I think. I feel like the hope is that we have one another and that our ground can be extended. I believe that sincerely. The other thing that gives me hope as of today is yesterday I read about this whale, the Cuvier-beaked whale, and it can dive 10,000 feet down below, no joke. But what's so amazing about it is that it has flippers and pockets that these flippers go into so it can dive even faster. And I'm such a pocket girl. I'm like that. If I wasn't a wolf raised by librarians, I'd be that whale. So, sometimes the natural world aligns with you. And so that's proof to me, hope yet.
Hi, I just want to ask both of you guys, in both the excerpts when we were reading, one thing I noticed that there was a certain amount of vulnerability in the way you were able to portray the fathers. And I can't help but to notice in some of the other writing and some of the other media I've seen, in which they portray people of color, particularly older generations, that's actually a bone of contention when you put them in that vulnerable position, either in your case, using the words, the Chinaman being forced into that Uncle Tom position, or in your case, being forced into the person who has demons that they're struggling with and that sometimes they get defeated by. How do you kind of portray that, and how do you kind of make sure that we kind of understand the humanity in your writing? Because a lot of times I've found, especially when my friends have written in that nature, they've actually gotten a lot of pushback. I've had it too, where people will say, well, that's something that almost makes it a bit of a mockery. We don't want to have to portray ourselves this way. We want a stronger, more virulent portrayal of what we can be and what we can do.
Well, I guess I would say that in the book, the father is portrayed in a lot of different ways. And he is an extremely strong and he has a presence. So he's not always vulnerable, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is that there's plenty of places in the story, both in the part of the story where the father and daughter are interacting, as well as in the historical fiction part, where the father, embodies, he's a complex character. He embodies a lot of other things besides vulnerability. So I wasn't worried about those vulnerable sections, because those are parts of him. And his vulnerability has to do with the positions he finds himself in, right? Like in this country, often vis-a-vis white men. So there's often the dynamics, like with Harry, right? There's Harry, but there's other Americans who my father has these interactions with that put him in a vulnerable position. So it has to do with power more largely. It's not just about his vulnerability. It has to do with the power dynamics that he lives with. So I think those ways. I think the key is that the character is fleshed out, right? They're not just this one vulnerable. It's not always that one vulnerable moment for him. That happens to be what I read tonight. I could have chosen other passages where he comes across very, very differently. And his relationship with me, actually, he was rarely vulnerable. So, my relationship with him was often one of contention and but then there are those moments like you describe in your reading where you see your father as vulnerable, right? And those are important moments too. So I think, again, it's just showing these different sides of him and showing him dealing with what it means to live as a Chinese in this country, especially at that time.
Yeah, your question makes me think about like your earlier question about like writers of color or artists of color and how we get to be, how we get to present, and how like you're talking about pushback, like from within communities, say, about like don't show them that, and it makes me think of Richard Pryor actually, and how radical and how wonderful his work was, right, and how uncomfortable, right, he made black folks feel like, no, among ourselves we can talk like that, but not out there. Right? And so there's this sense of like we present a certain way to white folks or like, like don't show like that side of us, But the larger question is like, can we just be? Like, can we show ourselves breathing, being, loving, like hurting without the awareness of how we look doing that to certain people? Do you know? Like, can we take up space and be? And I think each artist has to decide for themselves, like, that question. But I think part of the discomfort is, like, maybe not yet. So then it becomes like, well, then when,
Hi. My question is around your role as speaking for others who perhaps don't want to speak, I guess. I was wondering if your fathers knew about the project, what they thought about your project as a writer, if you ever woke up in the middle of the night going, I can't write about this because this is a private thing, how you navigated sort of the personal side of this. Especially if there was discomfort, or if did you show your fathers the manuscript and ask them if they would let you include certain details?
So I left home when I was 16, and I was not in touch with my family when I was writing Gangster. And Gangster is taken from, there are autobiographical moments in Gangster, but I use them as kind of moments of departure. So it's very much a work of fiction. It's drawn from my life. My parents' names are my parents' names. All their jobs are what my parents did. So, I'm a refugee. I grew up poor in San Diego. All of that is true. But when I wrote Gangster, I wasn't in touch with my family. And I never ran anything by I wasn't in touch with my parents at that time. My mother passed away before the book was finished. I did do an excerpt of a performance that is an adaptation of the title chapter, The Gangster We're All Looking For. I developed it into a performance called Red Fiery Summer. And I did an excerpt of it in San Diego, and that was the only reading that my parents came to. And my mother afterwards, I was with her in the audience, and people were coming up and saying, oh, thanks for the reading and all that. And my mom turned to them and was like, thank you, thank you, thank you, And I love that memory. And then my father, the interesting thing is my father didn't say much. But that day, like back at the house, eating lunch, he told me something. He decided that I was ready to hear about something that he had never told me when I was a child. And that was that his father's parents, one of his father's parents was a gypsy from India, right? And so this is something about my family I never knew. So something about experiencing the reading made my father feel like now I was ready to actually know more about where I came from. And that's not in the book or anything like that. But, you know, the thing is, like, the thing that not bothers, how do I say this? I worry that people mistake Gangster for my true story, you know, because I have siblings and I don't write about them in the book, all of that stuff, you know. So there's that. I sometimes feel a little uncomfortable, like, but hey, where's your sisters? Or, you know, yeah. But so far, I feel like with my younger siblings, the book, they feel like it's allowed them, I think, to understand something about our parents, so that they didn't before the book. So their experience of my parents as a result of Gangster, that portrait of the parents, I think has helped or been useful for my siblings. And younger Vietnamese Americans have said the same thing to me at readings, that they feel like they understand their parents better because of that book. But my own parents, my dad has seen the book. He, I think, has read the book. He wonders why he's not on the cover of the book. Yeah.
Well, I think the answer to that question in terms of my book is in the title. Because this notion of an accomplice emerged very, very early on in the process. You know, my father is the one who actually initiated a new conversation, right, about his past. Although, like I said at the beginning, I had been doing the sort of filial daughter thing, right, trying to write the family history, you know, trying to do those things, going back and forth with him to China, interviewing relatives, doing these things that, you know, are sort of, you think they're expected and you think this counts as family history. But it was my father who initiated the break with that way of thinking when he, you know, near the end of his life, decided to tell me something, just me, and then asked me to keep it secret from everybody else. And I said, I can't do that. And then that began a conversation that lasted for really till the end of his life in 2011. So in some ways, this book was collaborative, but I think accomplice is a better word than collaborator. Was there a crime committed? I mean, that's the next question, right? When you say that somebody is an accomplice, and that maybe gets to your question a little bit, that I've created some things here with my father that they're not all of my own making, because he was pushing for certain things too. So it's very hard for me to draw that line and say what was mine and what was his. Of course, the book is mine, and he knew, and he had me. I often read it to him. I would read these passages, and it became a further way for us to have a discussion. So, yeah, accomplice to memory is really, I think, the best answer to the question.
Just speaking to your earlier discussion of form, I was thinking, like, within Asian cultures and within our families, there's often strong oral traditions that aren't valued under this, like, wide Western cultural hegemony we live in, where everything has to be written, so it won't be history if it's spoken. So I'm just wondering, as writers, what do you think of the relationship between the literary and the oral? Like, how do you see yourself honoring these oral traditions? And this is something I struggle with myself in my writing. Like, I feel like I write to feel closer to my family. I write to feel closer to my ancestry, but there's also a disconnect in my writing in that, like, as much as I can write, like my family cannot connect to it because we come from different histories and different educations. So this was a very fragmented question, which I feel is metaphorical in a sense, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Thank you.
Well, there is a big difference between the oral and the written. They're very different kinds of stories. And I think for me, the writing was necessary because I felt like the oral, for so long, was the stories that were told were the same, the same stories told over and over again. I don't know if it's like that at all in your family, where there are certain stories, there are certain narratives that are told, and they just become part of your so-called family history. But it's when those narratives get disrupted or questioned, or when you question them, or you push further with them, right? Because somehow that narrative's not answering your questions anymore. I think that's when something new could emerge. And I feel like the writing is necessary, though, because it is the way for you to claim some of that as your history, and not just having it be the history that your parents are able to tell. And there's a lot that they're unable to tell. And I think you need to claim that for yourself, even if they're not, maybe they're not going to acknowledge it. But it sounds like in both of our cases are, in a way, I mean, you read that quote at the beginning that my father, in some ways, was looking for me to set him free. I mean, there's a way in which I think, even when we come up against those barriers with our parents or our families, there might be other desires there, right? There might be other conversations that are possible besides just hitting that wall every time with them.
I think there's a strong link between oral tradition and written language, actually, in that they're both forms of transmission, and that I think we were making sounds and songs before we were writing things down, and those sounds and songs they implant, so the first song is just a song that a mother makes through, a lullaby. And the point of the lullaby is to soothe and console the child, right? So a cry elicits a lullaby, soothes the child to sleep. But the rhythm that the lullaby kind of there's a transmission of rhythm. And I feel like stories are transmissions. I strongly believe that. I think that the written tradition goes back to song, in that songs are embodied forms. We feel them, we carry them, and that stories were told in a certain way with rhythm, or character plot moved in a certain way vividly, so you would remember. And listening was about the idea that you may then be asked to tell the story. So pay attention. And I feel that, so to me, it's like when you're working with form on the page, you're laying it down as a vehicle for transmission. The way that the reader takes in the paragraph, the sentence, the image that is created, the whole thing is a form of transmission, breath between the writer and the reader. And where the reader goes with it, what they do with it, I don't know. But I am breathing onto the page, through the characters, through this language, through this arrangement, very precise amounts of love, very precise dirt of place, very precise leaf of tree. You get what I'm saying? And I feel like the responsibility of the reader who comes to meet me in this place of the book is to carry it somewhere. Because the thing I'm moved to put down has carried me this far. So I think there is a strong correlation between the oral tradition and trying to work with language in new ways. I feel it very profoundly. And so sometimes I think, that's why I think you may not know what someone is saying, but you see their face, you hear their voice, you understand. Not the sense necessarily, but something that they need to convey. You do. We do that every day. You see a lot of faces, you look at a face, you do. You get it. You get something. Something is conveyed at all times to us.
So that might be, I think we should probably wrap up so that you can avoid the blizzard. But please order Kim's book. Please go back and buy Thuy's book. Live with these books. They're really fantastic. And I'm so grateful that the workshop was able to convene this, because it was a really fun pairing. And I had a great time. Hopefully everyone else did. So round of applause. Thanks everyone for coming out.
Thank you.